Hi everyone, Martin here. I am talking with Melissa Agnes. Melissa Agnes is a crisis management strategist, author of a fantastic book, Crisis Ready, and also speaks to organizations about really how to create and develop an invincible brand all around the world. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So in your book, Crisis Ready, you talk about this idea called the CRP, or Crisis Response Penalty. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Okay, so the CRP, the crisis response penalty, is a term that I coined when I was frustrated with seeing needless impacts of a crisis on an organization as a direct result of mismanagement. So of not being crisis ready. So the CRP, crisis response penalty, is exactly that. It looks at the short-term and long-term monetary and reputational impacts of a crisis on a brand, on an organization, as a direct result of mismanagement. So short and long-term monetary reputation impact as a direct result of mismanagement. So needless penalties, right?
Right.
Needless consequences. And an example to make that real is that I like to share is the example Dr. Dow and United Airlines
Right.
that happened, several months ago now, or a year and a bit ago now. But so for viewers, listeners who may not remember or weren't aware, United Airlines needed to take 4 paying passengers off their flight, which is common practice, unfortunately, or was at the time, off their flight to accommodate 4 of their crew members who were deadheading to the next destination so that they could fly those planes. So deadheading is when your plane that you're catering to or working on is at a different destination. So you're taking this plane to get to work. They needed 4 seats. They randomly chose 4 people. Dr. Dow was one of those 4 people, and he refused to get off. And what happened was it escalated quickly. The crew called in airport security, and the incident ended up with Dr. Dow being brutally physically dragged, his arms behind his head, off of the plane with a bloody face and crooked glasses. And one of my crisis ready rules is always assume there's video. So of course this was captured, and it was immediately posted online, published online, and it went instantaneously viral around the world, causing a rightfully so, right? An understandable uproar and upset. And it took United 48 hours to respond effectively to that incident. And I want to underscore the term effectively there, because they put out 3 responses throughout those 48 hours, but none of them were effective. So one of the responses apologized for having to inconvenience passengers, which was nowhere near what people demanded an apology for or expected, merited an apology for. One of the other communications was they apologized for having to reaccommodate passengers. Again, entirely missed the mark. And then the third communication was a leaked memo that Oscar Munoz, the CEO of United, had sent to his team, saying, I stand by the decisions and actions made, by our crew on that flight. And that got leaked, and it 100% counts as a communication, because it was. And again, completely missed the mark. And so over the span of those 48 hours, United watched as their market cap dropped by $1.4 billion. So if we want to look at it just in the sense of short-term monetary impact as a direct result of mismanagement, so completely avoidable had they responded appropriately, had it not happened in the first place, but had they responded appropriately, had it happened, that's a $700 million a day needless mistake. And then if you want to look at long-term material impact as a direct result of mismanagement, things like it changed, legislation changed for the industry. So it impacted the industry as a whole. And Oscar Munoz, the CEO, his employment agreement was amended, so he will no longer become the chairman of United. So personal accountability impact on him as a leader and to his personal brand, to his profession, right? To his professional life. And so the CRP is really looking at, a lot of times people will come to me with the challenge of, United bounces back, so who cares? But there's a lot of reasons to why you should care, right? Who wants to suffer a $700 million day needless mistake? And just that alone, why would you do that? Why would you not be in a position to say, we understand that risk materializes. We understand that risk is a part of business, and we want to suffer the least amount of crisis response penalty as we possibly can in the event of any type of unwanted negative event. Yeah, that's the CRP.
So really, in a world where the longer you take, and this is a key here, to effectively
Yeah.
respond to a crisis, the more CRP you suffer. So how can communications professionals set themselves and their teams up for success?
Okay, so there's a few things that you can do that are really essential. One is creating a baseline of understanding throughout the organization. So in order to effectively communicate, you need support and buy-in from leadership, 100%, which means what? It means that leadership needs to understand what they can expect in the event of a viral issue or a crisis, what the risks and the impacts of those expectations are, what the CRP is, and essentially the longer you take to effectively respond to any type of crisis, three things happen. The more you lose control over the narrative, the more trust and credibility you risk losing with those who matter most to your business. The trust and credibility that you've earned over the years, right, can just dissipate. And the more crisis response penalty you suffer. So making sure that leadership understands all of that and all of what that means, and how to, giving that education on, this is the reality, this is the risk, this is the impact of the risk, and here is what we can do now to be ready for that, to respond effectively in real time. So having that buy-in and support, gaining that buy-in and support, that takes work. That's a thing to do, especially depending on who is involved within your organization. And then from there, it's developing the right processes. So one of the things that I see far too often is that consultants will come in, as an example, and say, we're going to help you create a crisis communication plan. And that crisis communication plan has some great wording, some great verbiage. It has, a lot of the necessities to help the organization get ready, the communications team get ready, 100%. But the biggest things that I see that it's missing and are so essential are the processes behind all of that. So who is responsible for drafting those communications? Who is the approval team to approve those communications in real time and then that's where the educational piece comes in. So you don't want to create a bottleneck. You don't want to have the approval team, sit on communications, and to approve them, it takes them hours. Then you're going to suffer CRP. That's the longer you take. So what is that approval process? Who's involved? Who needs to be involved? Are they trained, et cetera, et cetera? And then once the communications have been approved, what is the dissemination process internally and then externally, so that you are assuring consistency across regions, departments, and stakeholders? And that, depending on the size of your organization, can be very challenging, and only challenging if you don't do it now, right? Like, there's solutions for it, there's strategies for it, there's a way to create redundancy so that you're not at risk of that being a risk to you in the event of managing something that you want to mitigate as much risk as possible. But you need to do that now in order to be successful in that. And then the third layer, very quickly, is training. So when, making sure it becomes seamless and it becomes muscle memory and it becomes common knowledge and anticipated and understood, and not just the approval team knows what to do and the communications team knows what to do, but everybody else within the organization knows that what that process is and what they can expect, and then what's expected of them once they receive them.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I have so many more questions, but we only have time for one more, and that is, how should communications professionals prioritize their communications to various stakeholders? In other words, in a crisis situation, who's most important to communicate with first?
Okay, so the key in effective crisis communication, the objectives are consistency across regions, departments, and stakeholders, as well as communicating what you need to communicate, right? Those, all of the essential components that you need to include within those communications, depending on the scenario. So let's break that question down into two stakeholder groups. You have internally and externally. Internally, you want to communicate to you. I mean, it has to happen in parallel and simultaneously, but essentially, you don't want employees to receive communications, ask their managers about it, and the managers to be going, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So there is a chain of rippling down that you want to do, but you want to make sure that that's seamless. It doesn't take an hour. It doesn't even take, 20 minutes, but just making sure that you kind of prioritize that. And then externally, you're going to judge it on a few things. First and foremost, safety. So this is all specific to different types of scenarios, which is why cookie cutter crisis management plans, crisis communication plans, which if you know me, you know that I really don't like those terms, don't work, because every scenario is nuanced in terms of strategy of response. So emergency first, people's safety. If it's a public safety, if it's a natural disaster, if it's a terrorist threat, if it's a workplace violence scenario, if it's an outbreak of some kind, like foodborne illness that, is immediate within the vicinity, you want to prioritize safety, emergency management, those types of communications to those who are directly in harm's way. Then you're going to look at impacted parties, right? So do you need to let somebody know something to protect, even if it's a vendor or a B2B customer or client, to make sure, because maybe your crisis is going to trigger a crisis for them. So you definitely want to prioritize them. Expectations. So do people expect a courtesy heads up, right? Versus just reading about it in the news or reading about it on your website. Fourth one, legal and regulatory requirements. So mitigating further risk as a result of your response, right? So making sure you're aware of all that. And then fifth, do you have the luxury of time? And I'm saying all of these things as break this down for every scenario to understand it, but effectively, you want to hit all of these all together. The real priority is people's safety. Everything is secondary after that. But all of those other things that I've said, an organization is made up of departments. Every department owns the different relationships with the different key stakeholders. So if you're doing your job right in creating those processes for dissemination, then everybody is getting it and everybody knows what to do with it. So while you're prioritizing certain key things to mitigate further risk and impact, it's still happening simultaneously across the board if you're doing your job right, which you absolutely should be.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. And I would encourage, all of our readers and community to check out Crisis Ready by Melissa Agnes, and find Melissa on Twitter at Melissa_Agnes. So thanks so much.